Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks very much for attending this Armor lecture today. Let me begin by acknowledging that Chicago resides on the traditional homelands of the Council of the Three Fires, the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi nations. Other tribes, including the Miami, Ho-Chunk, Sauk, and Fox, also have deep ties to this place. Located at an intersection of great waterways, it became a site of trade and healing for many tribes. Today, Chicago is home to the third largest urban American Indian community. This land was and remains Native land. We are extremely fortunate to have Paul Robbins visiting the museum today. Paul is the Dean of the Nelson Institute for Environmental Studies at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, where he guides the Institute, serving as a world leader in addressing rapid global environmental change. Among his responsibilities has been responding to a charge by Chancellor Rebecca Blanc in 2014 to help create a Native Nations UW working group to guide UW-Madison tribal relationships and innovations in tribal outreach. As a scholar, Paul has become one of the most influential cultural geographers of his generation. His work mainly focuses on human interactions with nature and the politics of natural resource management, addressing questions that span conservation conflicts, urban ecology, and environmental and health intersections. He's done extensive field work in rural India, where he's examined the politics surrounding forestry and wildlife conservation and mosquito and elk management in the United States. Paul previously led the School of Geography at the University of Arizona, and he's taught also at Ohio State University. He's the author of numerous books and articles, including the foundational textbook, Political Ecology, A Critical Introduction, and award-winning Lawn People, How Grasses, Weeds, and Chemicals Make Us Who We Are. Last but not least, Paul is a generous and brilliant teacher and mentor, which I say gratefully from personal experience. So please join me in welcoming Paul.
Thank you to Jacob. Thank you all for coming out. I just want to say it's a huge honor to be here, enormous honor. I had a chance to visit some field sites south of the museum with Jacob yesterday near Bronzeville, and was just blown away at the Field Museum's commitment to community engaged restoration ecology and the waterfront. What I saw this morning and the conversations I've had about the collections and the curation, especially of Native American representation in what we all know is a fraught history of all of our institutions, is truly awe-inspiring. The Field Museum has an enormous amount to be proud of, in my opinion, the humble opinion of a single observer. I'm really overawed. So I've said all the nice stuff. And now what I want to do in furtherance of my topic today, which is John Muir, who we all love, is to reiterate the question of land acknowledgement, just to build it out a little bit further. Of course, my own university resides and occupies ancestral Ho-Chunk land, a land they call Dejope and have since time immemorial. But so too, the university, as does every land grant university under the Lincoln Morrill Act in the United States, rests on endowments of cash money from liquidated resources, especially forests, from across the country. So when we bring out land acknowledgements, it gets even more muddled when we consider that the University of Wisconsin sits on the California genocide as much as it does on the forced removal of the Ho-Chunk people. That goes a long way to say what I want to discuss today, that the topic of my conversation here is really just a book written by somebody in 1912. But in a sense, it's really about the trauma of American memory, or more accurately, forgetting of the entanglements at a truly national scale of conservation with the history of forced removal and genocide, in which the public lands and national parks movement is only one part, but an important part. I should say, autobiographically, this revelation about a book thrust in my hand by Jack Kloppenberg randomly one morning came at a really good time. I'd gotten to a place probably about a decade ago when I took this job that I decided political ecology wasn't very useful anymore, and I didn't want to do it anymore. Maybe it's like middle age, and it felt like an artifact of 1990s political economy, and dare I say, post-structuralism, if anybody even says that word anymore. But now the last few years, to be honest with you, have made me think twice on that question. I actually feel that repressed memory of violence always revisits us, just like political ecology does, and that our current madness is actually one rooted deep in American memory of violence from which this tormented nation was born. And this violence, just when you think you've forgotten it, reannounces itself with a vengeance. Indeed, it's a violence whose very forgetting causes the ruptures of the present. In other words, it isn't remembering the violence, it's forgetting it that does the work. So that makes me believe that political ecology is the right form to write in and to still think in when it comes to coming to terms with that. What I want to briefly ask here is, what do we do with that forgetting and memory of violence? My colleague Sarah Moore and I, who is a co-author here, hope to persuade you by way of detour into the life and psyche of John Muir that we can't work through that. We can't cure the disease unless we have the tools and the power to name it, or more accurately, to recognize it right in front of us when it is named. This is John Muir's book, The Story of My Boyhood and Youth, written in 1912, fitfully in a way that I will describe. It was his last work. He was to die in 1914. And I believe with the proper reading, it can tell us a great deal about our commitments as conservationists and our commitments as people who share the land with the First Nations who live here. It's the absence of reflection on, what did I want to say? I'm already ahead of myself. So what I want to say is, does John Muir have a vocabulary, a language to name what is inhibited? And I would say, on the whole, he does. Long before Muir hiked the Sierras and explored Alaska or courted Theodore Roosevelt, when the time about which he writes in this book, he was a young member of a migrant Scottish settler family that settled in rural Wisconsin in the 1840s. And his accounts of that resettlement moment are wonderfully recalled in the book that I'm describing. It's actually it's a read that's much overlooked. The Story of My Boyhood and Youth is notable in a bunch of ways, including there was hints of Muir's father's profound brutality, which I think is an interesting theme, not a topic here, as well as Muir's own loving descriptions of American flora and fauna. I mean, we associate him with Alaska and California. If you want to hear him write about the upper Midwest, this is the book you actually have to go to. The book also has you feel the childhood roots of a legendary observer of the natural world. It's a real treat. It's a great book. But more than this, and more to the point, Boyhood and Youth is notable for the ongoing description of indigenous people. Not only are images and descriptions of Native Americans present throughout, the word Indian appears in this really slim volume 58 times. Detailed accounts of Native practices and lifeways fill the pages of this book. Muir walks Native trails. He observes Native hunters. He describes Native landmarks. Indians abound in the Wisconsin of his early days. Now, this is remarkable insofar as the works of John Muir have been noted, not by me, but by other smarter people, for their deafening silence on the role of Native peoples in occupying, foraging, and tending the environments that he so often described as wilderness. That's not news, right? His work, even when acknowledging or lamenting the status of Native peoples, which he definitely does at points, is further marked by the absence of reflection on either the elimination of Native peoples from the land or the relatively recent genocide of indigenous communities in and around the exact locales that he revered most in his writing. I'm looking at you, Yosemite. Moreover, though at times describing respect for many Native practices, and there's unquestionably that in his oeuvre, especially during his time in Alaska, which is a particularly interesting set of texts, Muir rarely mentioned so much as a conversation with an Indian, and has often invoked his dislike of Native peoples, describing them, and I'm quoting, as dirty, deadly, and lazy. That is in direct reference to the Miwoks of Yosemite. Nor are native peoples commonly described by Muir as key actors in revered nature. They had, quoting here, no right place in the landscape of wild California, unquote. That's Muir. In Ross Wakefield's words, the pedestal of John Muir's nature was simply too high for the Indian to attain. Now, none of this is unique to Muir, right? I mean, as my friend Kim Stanley Robinson, the author, points out as one of the great apologists of John Muir, he was a man of his time, right? Okay, I give you that. The divine manuscript of Yosemite's landscapes, not for Muir alone, right, from which Muir sought a lot of important spiritual lessons, as Bill Cronin reminds us, was one fashioned by God rather than by people. As such, Muir's profound invocations of these landscapes as unsullied by human impact of any kind or influence were simply part of the habits of thinking, the epistemology, really, of the late 19th century that led to the creation of the wilderness movement, for which we owe a great deal, in which native peoples and their impacts on the continent played very little symbolic or material part. Okay, this is not, in other words, a celebration or a condemnation of Muir. It is a symptomatic reading of the text to help us understand ourselves. And the Sierra Club is wrestling with this stuff right now. So none of this so far should be news to anybody here or especially controversial. What is interesting about the book is that given the total absence of Indians in Muir's other works, why do they so haunt the narrated landscapes of boyhood and youth? What are they doing in this book? It was a puzzle when Jack Kloppenberg handed me this book and said, oh, you got to read this. It's about Wisconsin, which it is. There's just Indians everywhere. What are they doing there? We therefore employ, and the only explanation available to Sarah and I, which is a symptomatic reading that argues that native presence in this work, which is among Muir's very last writings, represents a return of repressed memory, both literally and metaphorically. Moreover, we suggest Muir continually repeated this memorialization, now as trauma, a term I will define very specifically in a moment, by assuming and enacting the preservationist figure of the father of the national park system, with implications for the exclusions and displacements associated with the rise of national parks in the 19th and 20th centuries. So from the outset, it's super clear that native presence in boyhood and youth is first and unsurprisingly a product simply of the moment in which he's writing about. But granted, he's writing in other places about places where there are Indians, but there's no question that they're definitely present on the Wisconsin landscape of the period. Coming in an early wave of Northern European farmers from Muir's native Scotland, along with Scandinavia, Ireland, England, these settler colonists entered a landscape only very recently wrested from native peoples, super recently, specifically the Winnebago, Ho-Chunk, and Menominee tribes in the region of settlement, which I'll point to in just a moment. The lands in and around Fountain Lake, you can see the dot on the map. It's now called Innes Lake, where Muir first settled from Scotland in 1849 at age 11, and later Hickory Hill nearby, two properties near Portage, Wisconsin, all fall within lands ceded by the Ho-Chunk in 1829, just adjacent to lands the Ho-Chunk ceded in 1837, so just a handful of years, right, before Muir's family takes control of the land. And only a few miles south of those ceded by the Menominee in 1848. That's 1 year prior to the Muir family's arrival from Scotland. So this is not old news. This is like landing on settled land in its moment. These lands are not far west from territories, as you can see, ceded by the Potawatomi and Chippewa. Moreover, that Indians would appear in this book shouldn't be super surprising, given that these lands were violently expropriated within not just living memory, like you'd have to go out of your way to forget them. It's also, something needs to be said about Portage, for those of you who don't spend time in Wisconsin. Portage is super special, and in 1840, it would have been super duper special. That's a technical geographic word in cultural geography for a spectacular cultural confluence, both tribal and settler. If you put in on the St. Lawrence Seaway in a canoe, and you got a good pair of arms, you can make your way up to the Great Lakes, basically unimpeded, find your way all the way up here to Lake Michigan, make your way up the Fox, right? Then down the Wisconsin to the Mississippi, and then down to New Orleans, and only pull your feet on dry land in one place in North America, and that's Portage. They didn't give the name for an accident, right? That was not a mystery to French trappers. It wasn't a mystery to the Ho-Chunk or the Menominee. This was the crossroads of the Great Lakes in native North America. Muir landed on a cultural jackpot land in its moment of most dire genocidal removal. That Indians show up, in other words, is just an empirical unsurprise, right? Following me here. Mention of Indians in the books also, though, I want to say, reflects a unique moment that Muir deliberately is trying to capture there in 1912, 1913, one where this native presence is really difficult to ignore, but where native peoples appear in their most poignant condition of repression and decline. It's precisely in that moment of the removals. Specifically, Indian is used as a key modifier in numerous elements of the landscapes of the book. Muir and his brother, these are all words from the book. Muir and his brothers ramble down Indian trails. They interact with farmers of Indian corn. They encounter Indian ponies, Indian mounds, Indian moccasin, and Indian wigwams. Most facets of the landscape, in other words, save those notably few imposed from European architecture and agricultural technology, receive this same metaphor. The word wild does not appear. The word Indian appears. That is the adjective of the book. This is a wild landscape, certainly, but its constituent elements are uniformly a part of native culture and practice. As to the presence of native peoples themselves, the book provides some pretty contradictory images. I'm going to walk you through them super briefly. Like, what did he make of these Indians when he was a kid? Or more to the point, what does he make as an old man of his making of these people as a kid? On several occasions, native hunters are described in action in the book. Spearing a muskrat comes up at least twice in a way that Muir clearly describes with unmistakable admiration. Those descriptions are familiar from other works, again, reflecting his very respectful attitude towards indigenous skills and ecological knowledge. But far more commonly, the Indians in boyhood and youth are hungry beggars. They are thieves, and they are a very frightful lurking presence in the text. Marauding Indians, and quoting there, are described performing all kinds of criminal acts, including the shooting of a pig, the theft of Muir's horse. This passage is especially interesting. It's Muir's horse is ostensibly stolen. He's a kid, right? He's 11 or whatever. And later returned to him by a farmer who claims to have taken it from an Indian. And Muir writes that when the Indian tried to sell her, the farmer said, "You were a thief. This is a white man's horse. You stole her." "No," said the Indian, "I brought her from Prairie du Chien, and she has always been mine." "You are lying," the farmer is reported to say. "I will take that horse away from you and put her in my pasture, and if you come near it, I will set the dogs on you." In this exchange are hints of larger issues underlying the book as a whole. It's not hard to detect through the repeated and haunting native presence in boyhood and youth, a combination of fear, violence, and even poignant injustice in the landscape associated with hunger and theft, as well as deep moral dialogues, both explicit and submerged, over the productivist imagination of colonial settlement. I'm going to get to an interesting bit. My point here is simply this. Indians are not a part of the story of the Boyhood and Youth book by John Muir. They are the story. That is what this book is about. And a quick read will confirm what I have said here. All right. This last exchange, by the way, on God's intentions for the land, which I want to get to here, also marks the final appearance of Native Americans here in the book, as it turns out, and in all the writings of John Muir. Did I miss that? Well, I'll narrate you through this. Muir's father, who he didn't much care for, gets into an argument with a neighbor, Mr. Meyer, over whether or not God intended for settlers to displace natives. And Mr. Meyer, the neighbor, says, Muir says, well, obviously God intended it. We're a lot more productive. More Europeans can produce more stuff on this land than natives, right? We've heard this argument before. Mr. Meyer retorts, actually, there are a lot of farmers who are way more productive than you are, Muir. Is it God's intention that you be put off the land? And John Muir, in retrospect, says that Mr. Meyer did get the better of that argument. It's an interesting point, and it is an interesting moment because it is towards the end of the book, and it is the last time that Indians appear in the book. And of course, it's the last time that Indians appear in any book by John Muir. The work reached print in 1912 for the Atlantic Monthly and was published in 1913 by Houghton Mifflin. Muir would be dead just one short year later. This work is, in that sense, Muir's final reflection, even if it records his earliest memories. And if you're into psychoanalysis, you should see where I'm going with this. That Native Americans, so absent and ignored in Muir's previous work, would return in such full force in such late reflection, we argue, is not a coincidence. This final reconciliation, which writes Native Americans back into the very foundational landscape of Muir's own life, we suggest is a case of return of repressed memory and experience. One that Muir had heretofore repeated, and I'll explain what I mean by that, in his devotion to wilderness preservation throughout his career. We further suggest that this reflects the larger trauma that played out in white settler colonialism of the era. It is a psychoanalytic ailment of the population, as emotionally sorted by American people at large over the next century. So I didn't put it in the title because you wouldn't have come. There's going to be Sigmund Freud. By repressed, what we mean is a thought or attendant affects and emotions that are too painful to entertain in the conscious mind and are thus driven into the unconscious of the subject. Of course, this defensive strategy, in Freud's words, is always an incomplete process that has disturbing ramifications because the repressed always returns. As Freud argues, the trauma is characterized by the return of the repressed memories, not by their forgetting, but by their re-enunciation, right? That is therefore by the failure of the defense. The reactivated memories, however, and the self-reproaches formed from them never reemerge into the consciousness unchanged. What becomes conscious as obsessional ideas and artifacts and take the place of the pathogenic memories, so far as conscious life is concerned, are structures in the nature of a compromise between the repressed ideas and the repressing ones. They come back, but they always come back changed. So what I'm doing by invoking Freud here is not dwelling on Muir's individual psyche or issues that he had with his dad, although he had some wicked issues with his dad, or anything he endured in his life, like where that metal thing went through his eye, or anything else about his individual experience. What we're trying to suggest here is that this repressed memory is symptomatic of American settler society more broadly, which marks the key period of disruption at this moment of settler colonialism, which gives us the national parks. The specific overlooked memory, which so haunts Muir, which returns in such force here, was very material and very recent. It's genocide that is being repressed. The lands on which the Muirs settled in 1849 were one of those whose final fate was settled in a short, violent, and decisive war, with which my audience, I'm sure, is better familiar than I am, waged just 12 years earlier. In 1832, the Sauk leader Black Hawk crossed the Mississippi into Illinois from Indian Iowa Territory with a large number of Sauks, Mesquakies, and Kickapoos to settle land set aside by treaty. The conflict that resulted in several pitched battles and massacres rambled all across Wisconsin, including the final Battle of Bad Axe near present-day Victory, Wisconsin, so named for the final massacre where as many as 600 warriors and non-combatants, women and children, were murdered and massacred by a U.S. Army gunboat. And you can visit if you'd like. If you're in La Crosse, you go 25 miles south on the river and you will find a somewhat problematic plaque memorializing Victory, Wisconsin. This was followed by a ragged retreat ending in Black Hawk's surrender and the death of most of his warriors. The whole thing is memorialized also in very deeply colonial language on a great big rock right in the middle of UW's campus, I might add. That conflict was notable for a lot of reasons. It's a super interesting war. It was really important to Andrew Jackson, but there was service participation by both Abraham Lincoln in that conflict and Jefferson Davis on the same side that time. Super interesting. The war's native geopolitics were also way more complicated than I pretend to understand. The Ho-Chunk sided with Black Hawk in that fight, and the Menominee sided with the Euro-Americans. Anyway, that's all to the side. The point is, the violence is right there in living memory of a young person, right? With the surviving folks in the land still present and described richly throughout this text. The upshot, right? Is there a slide? Yeah, sure. The upshot's this. The 1832 conflict represented the final armed struggle of resistance to white settlement east of the Mississippi. Wars would rage on, as we well know, in the West that are probably better memorialized, but that was the last major armed resistance in the East. From here forward, the erasure of Native presence and memory on the land would be the key landscape practice in the progressive narrative of American settlement history. Only 1 decade after this event, Muir's childhood would unfold on land seized in the wake of that struggle and interpreted necessarily in its aftermath. So what does this mean? That these Native peoples then reappear forcefully in Muir's memory precisely at the end of his life. Why do they reappear on the place of their original elimination instead of in Yosemite? A puzzle we haven't quite entirely figured out. While repression, as described above and from Freud, gives us some hints, I'm going to give just a little more psychoanalysis and then we're out of here. 3 innovations by Jacques Lacan help us sort the case. Lacan observed that language is never able to fully capture what it's trying to represent. That experience always exceeds language. The realm and order of the real of your experience, that is, causes and enhances trauma because it cannot be reconciled with the subject's story about the world as told in the symbolic. That's pretty fundamental Lacanian theory. So the figure or image of the Indian in this sense lurks in the real of the landscape. These folks are present. They are present today. The Ho-Chunk are present now in a way that continually haunts the discursive erasure in Muir's work in the landscapes of Wisconsin, and from which these people were never successfully eliminated, I should say, no matter how hard the state and the settlers tried. The result for this, for Lacan, is that repression of memory tends to engender a repetitive compulsion. You can't forget it, but you can't remember it. The subject returns the memory while not consciously addressing it by continually repeating and performing this repression, often with very material effects. The term Lacan uses for this jagged irreconciliation is trauma, which is distinct from what I think we would intend when we talk about the real trauma, which was, of course, visited and experienced intergenerationally by Native peoples. But in the Lacanian sense, what it means is you repress the memory and you re-announce it all weird, which is to say the return of the native is the return of the national park. Arguably, Muir's, and here's the Ho-Chunk's elimination and return, Margaret Pierce's maps are stunning in your exhibit and much better than this one, but this is what I got. And again, present here today. Arguably, Muir's historically crucial preservationist crusade, and by implication, the birth drive behind all the national parks themselves, is an example, I would say, of repetitive compulsion. That's what it is. It's the way to work out the problem. Unable to consciously address complicity in and benefits derived from the violent exclusion of Native Americans from the landscape of Muir's youth, or really for that matter, all of our youth, he, and in turn America, become the revolutionary progenitor for the national park system, predicated part on the expulsion, both discursive and physical, of Native peoples across the continent. These expulsions are necessarily revisited again as ghosts inscribed in a textual return to Wisconsin of Muir's past near the very end of his life. And in a separate contemporary essay in his late life, Muir describes the writing of the book being super difficult. Like the guy wrote a lot. He couldn't get this one out. Like, how do you read that? Invited by his patron, Edward Harriman, to join him in Harriman's Pelican Bay Lodge in Klamath Lake, Oregon, Muir repeatedly experienced blocks to his writing, which he described. He just couldn't write this one down, right? So what does he do? Harriman provides Muir with a stenographer who follows Muir around the property for weeks on end while Muir just talks and tells his stories. The stenographer records them in rambling reflections, which are edited after the fact and become the heart of boyhood and youth. It is not difficult to conclude, even for an amateur like me, that the struggle to write boyhood and youth itself represents the return of repressed memory. And even more radically, I would suggest the stenographer is a proto-analyst of a kind, a talking cure. So that's it. The Park Service is a product of psychoanalytic trauma. No, not a small argument, I guess, now in retrospect. But whatever. Does this tangled history, though? So what does that mean? All right, great. Thanks, Paul. What does that mean? What, from a practical point of view? Does it defeat the possibility of learning and reconciliation? By no means. I actually think it's the entryway, right, to that reconciliation. It's really fair to say that Muir's views on Native cultures and peoples evolved over his long career of writing and travel. As Fleck notes, Muir's vital contact with Native Americans unquestionably enriched his spiritual experience of the iconic writings of his land. And though the myth that Muir was named an honorary chief of the Tlingit people during his time in Alaska has been totally debunked, and I don't have to convince you that that's a bunch of BS, but it followed him around for a long time and he enjoyed it. There is no question that Muir's impressions of Native people in Alaska did affect his thinking profoundly. Even so, Muir's late reflections on the landscape of violence and loss associated with what he understood to be a dying culture, right? A culture passing into the past, which by no means was ready to do, hints at something more. So in the wake of the Black Hawk War and the rush of white presence on the landscape, not yet fully evacuated by those who tended it for millennia, Muir's final work suggests the return of repressed memories, symptomatic of this expansion. I think that's something we can actually work from as opposed to work against. Let me make two critical points. To be clear, genocide of Native Americans visited its premier and most violent trauma on Native Americans, right? On communities and tribes of Native peoples themselves. Heightened suicide rates, poverty, and ongoing struggles for sovereignty are daily inheritance of that ongoing trauma. But as I've argued here, these events were accompanied by a rupturing and political forgetting. The second violence is to forget. Enacted not only the bodies of Native people, but also on the landscapes they formerly inhabited and into the settler cultures that entered and sought to reconcile themselves on that land. The environmental culture of America was formed in that moment, whose memory can never be fully repressed and which reannounced itself throughout the history of modern American conservation. So while Muir's chief achievement was the preservation of public lands at a time of expanding capitalist exploitation, the problematic of the public was something he simply couldn't resolve. The unconscious in boyhood and youth points to the scars left on the land of his childhood in that inability to resolve. These peoples form the constituent outside of the public for whom such land should be conserved and so are expelled from the land itself. And that's my first caveat. That's a long caveat. My second one's a little quicker. This is not a historical story. The Ho-Chunk are present in the place we now call Wisconsin today. The simple fact of remembering that fact is itself the place from which public lands can be reconciled, or certainly not without that memorialization. Over the last 150 years, the Ho-Chunk people were constantly and continuously expulsed to be interred places further west, far from their homelands, and remarkably, time and again, they walked back or canoed back. Native Americans in Wisconsin have never been historical, largely because they refused to be. In recent decades, the Ho-Chunk people have had lands restored only in small part in the state now known as Wisconsin and are currently holding about 8,800 acres scattered across about 20 counties of the state. But only after the 1974 Indian Claims Commission found the tribe to be victims of fraudulent treaties. To be super clear, and the Menominee, as we all know, now hold more than 200,000 acres, but only after a harrowing period of tribal status termination between 61 and 73, as we all know. Return of people, return of land require a return of violent memory, which are forever entwined in the landscape of trauma. To name this is part of transcending the injustice. So several decades into the political ecology experiment, to close, I think it's fair to ask ourselves, what is political ecology good for, or historical geography, or cultural geography? I mean, are these just dead practices? Do they belong in the ground with John Muir? I'd say when they can name the things that disrupt our memory and bring back into view that which is repressed, it's most certainly still something in scholarship that should be practiced. It's a thing you should probably do. And in America still trying to reconcile itself with the history of its own tormented landscape, through those stories, we're invited to expand our vocabulary precisely to words like repression, memory, trauma, genocide. Those are useful words, and used correctly and with care, they can be a very practical part of simply doing things like coming up with fire management regimes for shared native prairies at the Kickapoo Reserve in the southwestern part of Wisconsin, where the Ho-Chunk share the land with the communities whose land was expropriated, settler communities, by the federal state to build a dam that never was completed. It is only by putting those words on a wall outside of the Kickapoo Valley Reserve headquarters that those two communities can have a conversation about what preserving that very large bequeathance is. So that's what I have to say about John Muir, native memory, And it's, of course, nothing, I would imagine, that's news to anybody here, given what I've seen in my last 24 hours on this settler property. I've been very impressed during my visit, and I thank you very much for your time and attention. Do I do like Q&A, or do I leave?
Stay put for now, please.
Right.
Thank you. Appreciate that, Matt. Well, thanks so much for such a provocative set of ideas for us to think about. And I'd like to open it up then to the audience for any questions, comments, ideas that you have. And we'll please raise your hand and we'll find a microphone for you.
Thank you. Very, very interesting, inspiring, provoking talk. I have two questions, or one question and more of a comment. The question is whether you have had the opportunity to talk about this research with a member of an indigenous community and what they like. I'm curious about how that conversation or set of conversations might have gone. And then the comment is more like how this trauma became so successful across geographies, countries, continents. No, I'm from Colombia, and it's a very successful country in declaring protected areas, and how it still is a very successful trauma. So how that like gets entangled maybe with other traumas happening in other geographies or something like that. Yeah.
Yeah, the second question is super. I'd have to give that some thought. I've got some first thoughts on the second question. On the first question, yes, I have had conversations about this paper with several enrolled tribal members, including Chris Caldwell, the president of the College of Menominee Nation. And I think what he would say is what most of you would probably say. It's like, okay, fine, whatever. Can we get back to work? And I like working with Chris. And my answer to that is this isn't written for Chris. In fact, that's a great answer. I prefer that answer to another answer that he might have given, right? I mean, I'm as curious what my colleagues from the sovereign nations think about my reading as anybody else. But the level of disinterest, I think, in the particular argument I'm making here is totally appropriate. This is about settlement. And this is about who's getting on the couch. This isn't, the Indians here are represented by me. I'm on the couch. So I guess that's my answer, is that has been reinforced in my conversations. There are academic Native scholars who I've engaged on this question, and some of their influence is seen in the ultimate draft here. Their biggest concern was, oh, here we go again with Muir, the historicization of Native presence, all the things that you work so hard in that display to undo, right? The way that you don't, that the Native is not some historic artifact, it's, present population with a complex history. There are ways you can present a story about Muir's childhood in the 1840s, which precisely reinscribes exactly that problem. I got a lot of feedback on that by colleagues. But I got to run this one by Kyle White yet, and we'll see what he has to say. The second question, I think every geography has its own genocide. Colombia, wow, I wouldn't know where to begin. The export of the park system. When I have made that argument before, I work in South Asia, and whenever I try to bring that up, they say, well, no, we invented this here. It's our own version, right? Americans did not export the park system to India. I would argue otherwise. It is a contentious point in the historiography of South Asian conservation. It is a very British version, which comes out of the Kingly States, the Tiger Reserve most notably being really an inheritance of the hunting preserves, quite specifically of indigenous, but not Adivasi, high caste communities. So does it then is it compelling? Yes. Is it compelling for the same reason? Yes. I believe it does repressive work, but I think the specificities of its repressive work would have to be specific to the geographies and histories of the place in question. I don't think we're re-announcing American trauma in Colombia. I think the Colombians are adopting a portable asset to forget their own violence. How's that? It's convenient. Parks are super convenient that way. Like, what could be wrong? I have dedicated my life to preserving biodiversity. Let's be super clear. I like parks. It's a very exportable urge. Doesn't work if it's just Yosemite. Well, I'm rambling now. I'm simply saying that's a great question, and if you'd like to co-author a paper, I would be willing to entertain that. What everybody needs is another paper. I think we got one here and then one here.
Thanks so much, Paul. Really, I'm glad you said that to answer to Paula's question about, for Native Americans, it's not repressed. It's
Right.
They live that, and they have passed on those stories generation to generation, and in some way, they have found ways to overcome them and to move on. And so, you know, the repression of memory, as you say, is settler, you know, that's the settler's problem. And it haunts us in many different scenarios, right? In African American history as well, as we're seeing in the case of Florida, et cetera, and in Palestine today. So this is all very relevant, I think, to the way we can think about how these colonial and post-colonial processes play out in our world. I did have a question. Forget it in my comment, but I just think it's important to say that, and then to talk about resilience and that, you know, in some ways the national parks, the park systems, whether here or in Asia, or they would have been a lot better off. They would have been more protective of biodiversity had Native peoples, indigenous peoples, not been excluded from the get-go. So I think that's also part of what we have to recognize. And I think it's sort of starting to come back, as you mentioned, with indigenous fire management techniques coming back and so on. And that, you know, we have to remedy the ways in which the methodologies that so-called conservationists adopted, which, you know, were flawed from the beginning. I guess that's a comment too.
Yeah, they're really important. On the latter point, the Forest Rights Act in India is a super interesting political document, in which Adivasi communities get forest rights. It has not been enforced. Mining companies get a lot of access to reserves that indigenous, it depends on, indigenous is a tough word to apply to Adivasis. I'm going to stay out of that argument. But I will say that people who were removed, people indigenous to that land were removed. And so you bet it's everywhere. And coming back to this point, yeah, this isn't for, of, or about Native peoples. This is about settlers. And maybe I'm just writing it for me. And that, if the paper only does that, then good enough. I'm sorry. Okay, I appreciate that. I just read Baratunde Thurston's How to Be Black. It's a very good book. I would recommend it. It's funny as hell and ouch. And you know, you just want to write a book of like how to be better at being white, but like that is not going to come out right. Go ahead.
I'm wondering, and maybe this is too fine of a point to be asking you to put on it, but the wilderness narrative that then Muir, in a sense, generates for that cultural moment, do you see it as something that was super specific to him and that he generated and that set a direction from there forward, or would the culture have produced that some other way in the absence of a John Muir?
The latter. I strongly believe that it is when we read Muir here as the advantage we have over Muir is that he's got all this text. But in a sense, he's an extraordinary figure and we owe him a lot. All right, park that and pretend he isn't for a minute. He disappears. I am a Broydelian historian in the sense that would you have the same outcome in Europe in the early 1800s without Napoleon? I would argue yes. So I have to make the argument that we would have conservation without Muir. This problem I am suggesting is symptomatic of the larger psychic problem of settlement. You can't name the native. You know something's gone wrong. Restoration is the restoration of the wild. I can't put it any more cleanly, as opposed to restoration of, say, land rights to the people that you just tried to murder. And that's as simple as that. And it's repeated over and over again. It's repeated by all of us, all of us, every very problematic words, but it's repeated over and over again by a broader public and a diverse public, relatively diverse public. My people came from Ukraine. You don't need Muir. We read Muir to look at the American psyche. So yeah, because he's the one who left us such a clear trail of breadcrumbs. That's a methodological injunction and a warning from you, which is that you read these texts to read the social psyche. You don't want to go down the rabbit hole of who Muir was or what his particular thing was. That's not, there are people who should do that, but they need to know something that I don't know about Muir. I know a lot about conservation biologists. I work very closely with them. I love them. They are my brothers and sisters. And they are working through this, just like Muir.
Okay. Hey. So first of all, great talk. It's the delay in questions. You did a very good job. But I have a question about, okay, so you've articulated the problem very well. It's a sort of trauma. What do you do about it? What do we do about it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of what the good things that I can point to, let's go to the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. The Kickapoo Valley Reserve is a site of all kinds of erasures, all kinds of violence, and all kinds of ill will. And it isn't just on the part of the Ho-Chunk. Native people were obviously had their land expropriated in the 1830s there and were just really pushed out of the southwest part of the state in a big way. The Ho-Chunk still don't have a lot of property down there. But so were a bunch of farmers, settler farmers. The federal government came along and promised them a big dam. Got halfway through it, and then the age of big dams ended, and they left, and all those people had lost all their land and got nothing. And the ill will there is deep. And the Kickapoo Valley Reserve was an experimental dialogue between the Ho-Chunk people and the displaced settlers who displaced the Ho-Chunk on what to do with land that was now getting run over by invasives. The biodiversity was declining. Use and access rights were really a problem for everybody. The flooding hadn't gone away. They created one of the most spectacular co-management systems. It is not governed by the Department of Natural Resources. It's not a state reserve in the traditional sense. I believe the state's contribution comes through the tourism department and not through the natural resources department, which is great. In a funny way. And the dialogues are very complicated, like who gets to use the land for what ceremonial functions are necessary, who has more rights than others in some places. But because they're working on this kind of empty space, and I don't mean that in a way like there was no history, but empty in the sense that the federal government had walked away from it, they were able to make their own rules, and it works. It's a great example, but it doesn't happen without everybody acknowledging what had happened to them, which includes to those farmer families who were put out, like white farmer conservative families. There, my friend who helped, was one of the first directors, talked about when the first meetings of celebration of having the land turned over were like. It was like being at an uncomfortable wedding, she said. The Ho-Chunk were over here, and all of the families who were willing to come to the table, a lot of them never came back, right? They're so angry. White settler families were over here, literally physically on the land. She has photos, slowly introducing themselves like two sides in a wedding of the family who'd never met before, having a conversation about a common project, which is the land. And it only works because both of them were, I think, able to acknowledge the expropriated nature of their encounter thoroughly. So I believe that rememorialization is part of it without getting hung up on it. It's the stepping stone forward. So that's an example of a way in which I claim that's a positive outcome. You have to visit to decide for yourself, or speak to Ho-Chunk communities or settler communities that actually have to help manage the reserve. But to the degree it's successful, and let's pretend it is, I think it's precisely because it understands the admonitions that are presented here, which is that you go straight through the trauma, whatever you want to call it, right through the remembering, and not around it. Like, okay, we're all done, and that's really important. If not important for the Ho-Chunk, certainly important for the white folks.
Okay.
So I guess that's my example, is that it's about a process. And if you build this into the process, you can do all kinds of very traditional, healthy conservation for biodiversity, floodplain management. It isn't just about consultation or inclusion. It's something deeper. There's a psychic wound here. That's what I'm saying.
So more of that, basically.
More of that. More of that while doing the other thing.
Yeah.
While doing good conservation.
Okay.
More of this. Because if you don't do this work, I think that's where things get hung up. And things get hung up a lot for a lot of reasons.
Okay, thank you.
I don't know if that helps. Visit the Kickapoo Valley Reserve. Say hello to Marcy West. Canoe.
We may have time for one more question. There is one.
I appreciate your patience. Nobody wants to hear about Sigmund Freud anymore. Just wait, I'll come back and tell you about Marx. Go ahead.
Hold, please. We're just locating the question.
Oh, so there's an online question. Those are the scariest.
All right, we had a hand raised, but it doesn't look like
All right.
they have a question at the moment. So
Okay.
back to
If there
Jacob.
really is a question, I have a fully public email at dean@nelson.wisc.edu. And I get all kinds of email in that account, including questions, which I'd be very happy to answer. Thank you.
Well, thanks for that. And thanks for a great talk, Paul.
Thanks.
Appreciate your visit.